To discuss language policy in Pakistan, it is but imperative to take a brief look at pre-partition language policy. Colonial language policies were imperialistic. They were dominant in nature, and wherever the colonial powers went, they imposed their language on the native people. For example, people in Algeria and Tunisia were forced to use French, learn and use French. Similarly, Spanish was used in many parts of Latin America, and English in Pakistan, India, Malaysia, and many other Asian countries. So, this use of English, or this insistence of the colonial powers on the natives learning English, created a native elite, and this native elite comprised the people who had successfully learned the language of the colonizers. And their job was to function as, or to perform, the lower level jobs for their colonizers. For example, some jobs in the lower ranks of civil service, work as clerks, etc. However, the British, especially in India, showed some tolerance towards the indigenous languages. And this tolerance was actually a part of their political policy. It was not out of sympathy for the native people or any respect for or consideration of the native languages, but this was a part of their political policy. Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General of India towards the end of the 18th century, used indigenization as a means of governance. So he thought that if there was less gap between the masters, the colonizers, and the local people, the governance will become easier. So he took certain measures. One of them included the support for the cultivation of indigenous languages, which included Persian, Sanskrit, and Arabic. And again, it was a strategy to please the existing elite of the country, which was already present before the arrival of the colonizers. So they believed, Hastings and some other like-minded people believed, that to govern India and other parts of the world where they had formed colonies, especially in Asia, so to govern these people more easily, it was important that they were kept pleased. And one of the strategies for keeping them pleased was helping them in cultivating their own indigenous languages. It was not only confined to supporting the indigenous people in learning their own languages, but efforts were also made for the British civil servants and other officers of the British Army or the administration to learn vernaculars. And again, the aim was to make governance easy and administration easy. In fact, they clearly called it a strategy to control the natives more efficiently. So, by learning vernaculars, the local languages, the British aimed to control these people more fully and more easily. Also, a large number of, well, not exactly a large number, but quite a few madrasas and colleges were also established all over India. Some of these madrasas and colleges were meant only for Muslims. For example, there were madrasas for Muslims and there were certain colleges for Hindus. And again, the aim was to keep the Muslim Maulvis and the Hindu Pandits pleased and to ensure their loyalty. The suggestion to teach English to the native people for the first time came in 1792, and it was made by a director of the British East India Company. However, this suggestion was resisted strongly by different people, including the parliament. When this suggestion was first made in front of the parliament, the British parliament, of course, they rejected the idea. And the reason for the rejection of the idea was that they feared that if the Indians learned English, it will lead them to learning other British values, British political values, and the values of freedom, etc. And this will then subsequently also inculcate in them a desire for liberty and this English form of government. So they feared that learning of English would not only stop at learning the language only, but it will enable the native people to develop these English ideas of freedom and more liberal ideas. Although their main aim behind teaching the Indian people English was to anglicize them and not to for example, encourage them to demand freedom or to hope for a similar system of government as was practiced in Britain. So the Anglicization only meant that they should free themselves of their conservative conventional ideas and follow these ideas which or the values, cultural values, etc., which were practiced by the British, and not really the system of government and political ideas. However, gradually the demand for instilling the ideas and feelings of civilized Europe increased. These people, the policymakers or the rulers in England, or the rulers who controlled the events or the happenings in India, they felt that the Indians were backward, ignorant people, and they needed to be brought some light in the form of these ideas, civilized European ideas. Although it was a biased point of view, but that is how they felt. They completely rejected all the knowledge or the culture that the Indians had. They thought they were backward, etc., and suggested that they should be given some light through these civilized European ideas. Gradually, Indians also realized that traditional ways of exerting power, for example, their conventional, conservative ways of life, were old-fashioned now, outdated, and they would not help them in obtaining wealth, getting jobs, getting education, etc. And their condition will not change unless they started learning English themselves. So what they wanted was that they could obtain this power which they were gradually losing by training themselves in English and becoming junior partners of the British for managing or for administrating the colony. So they thought that they could become partners of the empire in running the affairs of the empire by training themselves in English. So gradually, when Indians started learning English, recommendations were made by including Indians in the civil service. Initially, this was confined only to some Bengali Hindus, but it was looked at as an introduction of modernity and new forms of power distributions. It was felt that the inclusion of the Indians in the civil service was a step that the Indians had taken towards modernity, and that they will also now be able to share power with the British rulers. The Indian middle class, especially, all these privileges of accessing the Indian civil service was open only for the elite of the country. But the middle class was not really given this access to jobs in the civil service. So the middle class considered English to be directly related to economic prestige, not only economic but also social prestige. So if you could learn English, you could get a job in the civil service, and that meant upward social economic mobility. So they also started demanding learning English. A demand was raised for education in English language. So gradually, in this way, in the undivided India, English became the language of the elite, press, and administration, even among the native people. So common people were restricted to learning vernacular only, and they did not have access to English education. It was only the elite who had access to English education, and they preferred English education. So in this way, India, the undivided India, was divided into two classes. One who had access to English education and the other who had access only to vernacular education. And this division then, of course, gave rise to other discriminations, and these discriminations have continued even to the present day.